The experimental plane Solar Impulse 2 is now in Tulsa, Oklahoma, after completing an 18-hour, 970-mile flight from Phoenix, Arizona. Pilot Bertrand Piccard is circling the globe using only the power of the sun. Piccard and his team set off from Abu Dhabi in March of 2015, traveling to Myanmar, China, Japan, Hawaii, and California. The plane has the wingspan as big as a jumbo jet, but weighs just as much as a family sports utility vehicle.
Solar Impulse has no fuel, it flies only with the sun. But it's the beginning of something, you know, it's really experimental, it's a door slightly open to the future, pushing the technologies to the extreme ultimate application.
The plane flies at less than 90 kilometers per hour, a fraction of the speed of a hot air balloon. The crew will next head east across the US to New York before crossing the Atlantic Ocean. You know, inventions like this are changing the conversation about solar and what it's able to power. Let's get back to our panel. First of all, I want to go back to Wang Tao in Beijing. Quite an incredible plane there. But China's thinking about building entire cities, in fact, is doing so. In Tianjin, is this a good model, considering there are 100 million people moving from the countryside into cities? You have to build this renewables from the ground up?
Yes, exactly. I think the urbanization is actually one of the most important drivers for China's economic growth, and also the movements that we have to address to accommodate the development and also people's needs. Every year, China has more than 13 million people moving from the rural areas to the urban areas to make a living. So this urbanization process will take decades until China probably will reach to the developed countries level. So how to accommodate those people in the cities, in the old cities and new built cities is a question. And China indeed actually initiated a large round of the low carbon and the so-called eco-city in China for the last few years. And one of the most prominent one is this one you just mentioned, the Tianjin Eco-City in collaboration with the Singaporean government. But I think there is also a risk or maybe a consideration that we need to take into account when we're talking about eco-city. Then Chinese city planners or local government always are fond of creating cities for themselves, for people. So they think that if they create, they clear out land and build the cities, build the buildings and plan out the road, there will be people moving into. So they are thinking about creating a city for the people. But indeed, actually, cities should serve for people's needs. You need to actually build cities around people's activities. It's not always the situation that when you build the cities and people just naturally move in, because people do not work there, they do not live there, and they found it's inconvenient. In some cases in China, they actually did manage to make people moving into the cities. Sometimes by the signals of the price of the housing, or sometimes by the government command. But people also find they cannot work there, they cannot find enough jobs there. Just as the case in Tianjin, I think it's too early to say whether this is going to be a very successful model or not.
Arunabha, Ghosh, in New Delhi, I saw you nodding heavily at that. You know, India also a rapidly urbanizing population. And, you know, if you look at the 19th century model in Europe, for example, urbanization meant more, of course, pollution and energy. How do we square the circle on this one? What's India's plan?
I think there are two plans there. One is a massive smart cities mission that the government has launched, which is to kind of upgrade existing cities as well as build new cities that integrate technology, new forms of building design, new forms of transportation design, and as Wang Tao was also saying, making sure that they become commercial hubs. But specifically on renewables, if you look at India's solar target of 100 gigawatts, 40 gigawatts of that, so 40% of that is meant to come from rooftop solar, which is basically your house,
right. Back into the grid.
School, the shopping mall, the hospital. They then become the kind of the sources of energy as well as the consumers of energy. So our solar targets are not so much as top-down, but bottom-up, converting the consumer into the producer and seller of electricity gives them a business interest and a stake in this new kind of energy system. But even in rural areas, we have another massive plan of converting irrigation pump sets, of which we have 30 million, several million of those into solar-based irrigation. And that itself can get us about 20 gigawatts of solar power. So there are multiple pathways, both in rural areas as well as in urban areas, for a renewables rollout in India.
Just fascinating, all this innovation going on, isn't it, Roberto? But usually, heavy extraction industries in energy like coal create the most jobs. But there are reports out there, for example, Brazil could create 4 million jobs by adopting renewable energy. Is this right? Because I always thought that renewable energies didn't create jobs. Look at wind farms here and stuff like that.
Thanks, Nathan. That's a great question. I think there's a number of policies that can be developed and can put in place to create jobs. When it comes, you mentioned Brazil. It's an interesting case because they have this local content requirement to have access to preferential financial funding for developers of renewable energy. And so, and this can come in different forms through percentage of investments, through local hiring, or through local inputs or materials, raw materials. And so if you want as a developer to access those preferential terms in Brazil through the National Development Bank, you have to include the local content requirements. And these sort of policies aim normally to create local jobs and create a local value supply chain.
It's interesting, isn't it, that so many parts of the world are leaping ahead with this. But Alex, we're also seeing one area, Europe, actually start lagging behind, even though they were pioneers of renewables back in the 1980s. Why is that?
Well, yeah, there's probably a couple reasons. I mean, right now, Europe is in an economic recession, so that's putting pressure on budgets.
But, I mean, the world's slowed down, China's slowing down, I mean...
Yeah, not as fast.
right.
But the other thing is demand growth isn't growing, right, for electricity. So in environments like China, India, where demand is growing fast for electricity, there's a lot of willingness to bring on new investment, new technologies to meet that growing demand, come up with innovative business models. In countries like Europe, where demand is flat, it becomes a little trickier because, you know, if you add renewables, someone's not going to be generating, and you get a stranded asset issue, and then there's more opposition to some of these plants. So, you know, there are a couple of factors that sort of explain the slower investment.
So a cautionary tale for developing countries as they become more developed as well. Tao, I want to focus on the technology because everyone thinks of solar power as the big panels on your roof. But something we discovered at the Arizona Summit and elsewhere is this technology is just becoming so incredible. In fact, Chinese companies are going to light up the Rio Olympic Games as they open. But we're going to see solar power potential on our smartphones, so we don't have to constantly charge them an outlet. So are you seeing the technology evolve in China and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think China is actually doing a great deal of the development in the solar PV and also other renewable energies. By investing into these industries, they actually help to reduce the cost because of the massive scales that China is investing and also manufacturing. And there is also, just as mentioned, China and countries like India is the country with the largest demand. So the market is growing very fast. That also provides opportunities for those technologies to be employed in these countries. So I think there is a great deal of the contribution that China can make.
I really have to ask this question of Arunabha. I travelled to India by rail when I was a teenager, and it completely was an amazing experience. I hear that now in India they're putting solar power solar panels on the tops of diesel trains to help actually bring in energy. This sounds like a really Indian innovation, using what you've got. Explain it to me.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the railways because the railways is the lifeline of India.
Absolutely.
And they, in a way, they serve as the cauldron of experimentation. So what these panels on the train carriages are doing, they can't give you traction power, but they can help you with the lighting, the air conditioning, etc., within the carriages. So that's a start. But guess what? We've got more than 8,000 railway stations in India. And so we now have a plan of putting in solar panels on the top of the platforms. Number 3, there are large numbers of railway residential colonies, and the plan is to again put solar panels there and use that to power neighboring villages. So the railways alone has a plan of putting out at least 1.5 gigawatts, so about 1,500 megawatts of solar capacity in the next few years. But what it does is it gets a lot of other people excited about it because you're interacting with that technology on a daily basis. And that's what I'm trying to say, that in India, the rollout of renewables is not a top-down story. It is really many different sectors, consumptive and productive and infrastructural and transport, which are opening up these opportunities for the consumers to see, here's a new technology. It's not going to solve all your problems overnight of air pollution, et cetera, but this is really the future, and here's where the business opportunities lie. And that's why India has spearheaded this International Solar Alliance of 120 countries, along with France, to bring them together to offer an even bigger market so that technologists, investors can look at this massive new market that is being created, at least generate $1 trillion of investment in solar power alone over the next 15 years.
Yeah, that's a very important step. Alex, last word, given what we've just heard from New Delhi, where do you think the new innovation is going to come from in terms of solar and renewables?
Well, there are a lot of exciting innovations, and I think, as was mentioned, the Solar Alliance, Mission Innovation, these international collaborations to bring the cost, invest in R&D are really important. I think there's a couple things. There's some new technologies that promise to bring the cost to about cut the cost by 75% over the next few years, which is really impressive. There's also innovations in the form of solar. So transparent cells that can replace glass, used in office buildings,
smartphones,
solar shingles, smartphones. So there's going to be a lot of innovation about where you can put solar and generate power. And so for cities, that's very relevant, where space is constrained. The other piece that we're finding is that with green buildings, developers are finding more demand for buildings that are green, higher occupancy rate, less turnover. That becomes a very valuable business proposition. So looking for ways to marry the business case of green buildings with the innovations and form of new solar technologies is going to be very exciting for the future.
Well, on that note, we'll end it. The future is bright for solar, it looks like. That's it for this edition of Heat. Thank you very much for